Welcome and thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Doris Weiss, Montrose, President of Children of Jewish Holocaust Survivors. The aggressive and ongoing attempts to restrict the Second Amendment has been troublesome to say the least. The stated purpose of these efforts does not make sense since criminals don't follow the law. So the result of these laws would be to keep weapons out of the hands of law-abiding citizens, rendering citizens unable to defend themselves against the criminals who are not law-abiding. Then there is the pride with which many establishments make it known that they are gun-free zones. What a perfect invitation to a criminal. The Nazis also understood the concept of a gun-free zone. Tonight we are privileged to have David Kopel speak on armed resistance to genocide. Professor Kopel has written an excellent essay entitled Armed Resistance to the Holocaust, among many other articles and books. The full copy of this essay is included in tonight's handout. If you didn't receive a handout, I have a few more, but the entire contents will be posted at our website. David Kopel earned his J.D. magna cum laude from the University of Michigan and his B.A. with highest honors in history from Brown University. He is research director of the Independence Institute, a public policy organization in Golden, Colorado, and is an associate policy analyst with Cato Institute in Washington, D.C. Professor Kopel is one of several contributors to the Volokh Conspiracy, a group weblog of law professors. He has written hundreds of opinion articles for periodicals such as the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the LA Times, and the Denver Post. He is the author of 12 books and 72 scholarly articles published in journals such as the Michigan Law Review, University of Pennsylvania Law Review, SAIS Review, and the Brown Journal on World Affairs. His topics include constitutional law, international law, criminal law, technology, antitrust, media issues, and environmental policy. He has contributed to 9 academic encyclopedias and served on the board of editors for one. His research has been cited by 8 state Supreme Courts, 3 federal circuit court of appeals, and over 500 law review articles. In 2008, he appeared before the United States Supreme Court as part of the team presenting the oral argument in District of Columbia versus Heller. His Heller amicus brief for a law coalition of law enforcement organizations and district attorneys was cited 4 times in the court's Heller opinions. His brief in McDonald versus Chicago in 2010 was cited by Justice Alito's plurality opinion and twice by Justice Stevens' dissent. He has testified numerous times before Congress and state legislatures, including before the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee of the Supreme Court nominations of Helena Kagan and Sonia Sotomayor. Professor Kopel appears weekly on Colorado Inside Out, a public affairs discussion program on Colorado Public Radio, Channel 12. Before joining the Independence Institute, he served as an assistant attorney general for the state of Colorado, dealing with enforcement of hazardous waste, Superfund, and other environmental laws. In 1998 to 1999, he served as an adjunct professor of law at New York University. From 2001 to 2009, he was a media columnist for the Rocky Mountain News. We are also privileged to have here tonight the Chief Judge of the Ninth Circuit Court, Alex Kaczynski, who is also a friend of mine, and also a child of Holocaust survivors. It was Judge Kaczynski's a portion of his dissenting opinion in 2003 on, I'm sorry, I can't remember the dates. It goes like this. All too many of the other great tragedies of history were perpetuated by armed troops against unarmed populations. Many could well have been avoided or mitigated had the perpetrators known their intended victims were equipped with a rifle and 20 bullets apiece. It was this particular quote that inspired everything else that I've done from there, including an initiative that we started called Jews Can Shoot, where we teach people to shoot. And there we have a few students are here, and it's a great class, and I highly recommend it. Professor Kopel will take questions following his this presentation. And we are, as always, grateful to the Lux Sunset Boulevard Hotel for their and their staff for providing us with this beautiful venue. At this time, please turn off your cell phones and your other electronic devices. And it is with great honor that I introduce to you Professor David Kopel.
Thank you. Great, thank you. That was very nice. So, back in the days of the Roman Empire, when it ruled Israel, the penalty for possession of a weapon by a Jew was death. The Baracopa rebellion by the Jews in the 2nd century AD was crushed, the diaspora happened, and for the next 1800 years, Jews lived all over the world with no homeland. And almost everywhere they lived, whether in Christian countries or in Muslim countries, they often found their best path to safety was not having arms. They might become the king's favorites because some of them had the wealth to lend the king money. Under Sharia law, it was illegal for a non-Muslim to strike or fight back against a Muslim, and so it would be dangerous to have arms in those situations. And whether countries were tolerant, as say Poland was in the Middle Ages, or much more oppressive, as Russia was, say in the 1700s or 1800s, the typical lesson that was learned was that it's really better if you don't fight back. That wasn't the case in every single situation over those many centuries, but it was the most common typical lesson. So if the Cossacks were coming to do a pogrom against a town, if you just let them have their way, and they might even kill some people, they'd leave. They weren't going to kill everybody in town, and if you fought back, it would probably make things worse and lead to more people getting killed. And that was a collective lesson that was very much absorbed by many Jews worldwide. Now, at Harvard, which by the early 1900s had long been admitting Jews, the kind of person who was produced by this mentality was not very pleasing to Harvard President Charles Eliot. He gave a speech to the Menorah Society at Harvard University on during Hanukkah 1907, and he explained that in his view, modern Jews were, quote, distinctly inferior in stature and physical development to any other race. And he urged the Jews to go get some exercise and suggested that it would be a good idea if many of you joined the militia, he said. Now, go for it. Some Jews decried President Eliot as an anti-Semite, but others said that he really was onto something and he had a good point. And the latter group were likely to be in that new kind of Jew that was beginning in the late 19th century, the Zionists. And the Zionist movement saw the physical world as extremely important, that the lack of a Jewish homeland was the end and the worst consequence of Jewish disconnectedness from the physical world. And that was the end, and the beginning point of that, and a cause of it, was lack of self-defensibility, lack of athleticism. Too many young Jewish men were good Torah scholars, but only that. Pale, weak, easily bullied by Gentiles, and passive and timid in the communities. They were easily attacked by mobs. And this led to a vicious cycle of a lack of self-respect and a lack of ability to demand a homeland or to demand and enforce safety from mob violence. And so especially in Eastern Europe, many young Zionists began joining self-defense organizations where they would be trained in armed defense. And in fact, many of the Jews who led armed resistance to Hitler in the 1940s had been trained in these Zionist organizations in the 1930s. Now, President Eliot's description of the Harvard students wasn't necessarily accurate for every Jew worldwide, and because in fact the movement towards Jewish physical self-defense had begun in some places well before Zionism had. For example, in England in 1760, Jews began participating in the sport of boxing. And in fact, the English boxing champion from 1791 to 1795 was a Jewish man named Daniel Mendoza. And he was the Muhammad Ali of his day, I suppose, in the sense, because he relied on speed and technique more so than just brute physical force. A political observer of the day explained that before Mendoza, before there was Jewish boxing in England, dogs could not be used in the streets in the manner many Jews were treated. One circumstance among the others put an end to the ill usage of Jews, and that was Mendoza becoming a leading boxer and setting up a boxing school for young Jewish men. The consequence was in a very few years seen and felt, too. It was no longer safe to insult a Jew unless he was an old man and alone. But even if the Jews were unable to defend themselves, the few who would now be disposed to insult them merely because they are Jews would be in danger of chastisement from passers-by and of punishment by the police. So when the Jews of London began punching the aggressor back in the snout, that not only stopped some aggressors directly, but it deterred many more, and it made the broader community see the Jews as being worthy of defended and led to greater community defense by the Gentiles of the Jews. And in fact, in the United States, there were days when boxing was a Jewish sport, as Jews were a immigrant population and got into boxing in the 1920s and 30s for the same reason that immigrant populations always have, is it was for some a good way to make a living. And in fact, Barney Ross, who was Jewish, won the lightweight, junior welterweight, and welterweight championships, retired in 1938, and then went on to fight in World War II at Guadalcanal and earned a Silver Star, and then went back and became after his military service, a very public, active Zionist, helping to recruit Americans to fight for the defense of the budding state of Israel. At this time, when if you were a sports fan, the most famous Jewish boxer you might know would be Mr. Ross. If you were a kind of person who read the newspapers at all, the most famous Jew you would know would be Justice Louis Brandeis. I think still regarded as one of the greatest justices ever of the United States Supreme Court, and in my view, the greatest progressive justice of all time. And also, in the American view, by far the leading Zionist in America. He was the public face of Judaism and of Zionism to the America in general. Let me read from you how he described what happened at Austrian universities in the late 19th and early 20th centuries when Jewish students in Austria took up the sport of fencing under the influence of Zionism. Zionism's effect, Brandeis wrote, upon the Jewish students of Austrian universities was immediate and striking. Until then, they had been despised and ill-treated. They had wormed their way into appointments and into free professions by dint of pliancy, mock humility, mental acuteness, and clandestine protection. If struck or spat upon by Aryan students, they rarely ventured to return the blow or insult. But Zionism gave them courage. They formed associations and learned athletic drill and fencing. Presently, the best fencers of the German Fighting Corps found that Zionist students could gash cheeks quite as effectively as any Teuton, and that Jews were in a fair way to become the best swordsmen of the university. And so today, he continued, the purple cap of the Zionist is as respected as any academic association. And Brandeis thought self-defense was important not just for students in Austria, not just for the the Jews living in what would become the state of Israel, then British colonial Palestine, but he thought it was an essential for everyone. As he wrote, we shall have lost something vital and beyond price on the day when the state denies us the right to resort to force. Well, one state that began to do that was the Third Reich. the best survey of the gun laws and gun law enforcement of the Third Reich is Stephen Hallbrook's book, Gun Control in the Third Reich. The lessons of Nazi gun control and gun confiscation were not something that has just come into the American political debate this year or 20 years ago or 50 years ago. In 1941, as the world was at war and Congress was preparing American defense, Congress passed the Property Requisition Act, which allowed the government to take, for fair compensation, property that might be needed for the national defense. And Congress specifically put an amendment onto that Property Requisition Act to say this could not be used to take any firearm from anyone, nor could it be used to require the registration of any firearm. And that's because the Congress at the time was well aware of what was going on with what had been made possible by gun prohibition in Germany and in Stalin's Soviet Union. Now, there are today people who will tell you that, oh, what good would it have done if the Jews in the Holocaust or any other genocide victims had had arms? You know, you can't run and go take a Saturday night special and go shoot a tank in an open field battle, and that is certainly true. And so, who cares? Well, it wouldn't have mattered in the slightest if the Jews had arms. Well, the Nazis thought very differently. The German gun control, after the defeat of Germany's defeat in World War I, the state collapsed, and there's a period of anarchy and roving gangs of warlords and lesser just gangs of ex-soldiers, many of them communists, roving the country. The government prohibited, tried to regain control of the situation and prohibited gun ownership entirely, although this didn't really seem to stop the violent criminal elements of the 1920s, most particularly the Nazis and communists, from being able to obtain arms. So in 1928, the Weimar Republic took the step of formally re-legalizing gun ownership. Their 1928 law required a license for anyone to own a gun, a license to purchase ammunition, registration of all the licensees. In 1931, they went a little bit further and clamped down on even carrying a knife for defensive protection in public without a special license, and authorized the various German states to require the retroactive registration of firearms. Now, when the Weimar government was doing this, they expressed concerns that we think it's a good idea, but what happens if these registration lists fall into the hands of extremists? Well, on January 30th, 1933, the entire government fell into the hands of extremists, and of course the registration lists came with it. It was on that date when Adolf Hitler was lawfully appointed Chancellor of Germany, having had the best success in the recent election, conducted under democratic means and under conditions where there was a free press, pro and con on all the issues of the day. Almost immediately upon seizing power, Hitler's government began using the registration list to confiscate guns, knives, and any other arms from the members of other political parties, with the Social Democrats being especially targeted. And then the Nazis began a program which they called the forcing into line, the regimentation of the entire society into the Nazi line, the destruction of all civil society outside the state. And for example, they required that all gun and shooting and hunting clubs had to re-register and be put under the control of a Nazi political official. And many of these gun clubs refused to do so and disbanded rather than fall under Nazi control. Now, these 1928 Weimar Laws, which were enacted by a well-meaning democratic government sincerely interested in public safety and sincerely concerned about the dangers of arms use by extremists in the society, and for them the Nazis and the communists, that law was so useful to the Nazis once they got a hold of enforcing it that the Nazis didn't change the law for 10 years after that. It gave them, the Weimar Law gave them all the power and authority they needed to do as they wished. And so it wasn't until 1938, until 4 days after the Anschluss of Austria, that the Nazis revised the gun laws. They claimed in their controlled press that it was a liberalization, but in fact it was actually making the laws even more restrictive to further ensure that only persons who were absolutely certain to be politically reliable would be allowed to possess arms. So that was March 1938. In October 1938, the Nazis used the arms registration lists to fully complete the disarmament of all the Jews, because there were, of course, still Jews living in Germany. Some of them, such as Albert Flatow, who'd been an Olympic athlete for Germany in the 1896 Olympics, had lawfully possessed registered arms and complied with all the increasingly severe restrictions, but all these arms were confiscated, and the Jews, many of them, even when they had arms lawfully, were arrested and put in concentration camps. And then, of course, the next month, with Jewish disarmament completed, Kristallnacht was unleashed on November 8th through 10th of 1938, with government-orchestrated mob violence against the Jews who were now ensured to have no arms for self-defense. So this nation, which as of 1900 had been among the most civilized, tolerant, pro-Jewish in the entire world, as of just 20 or 30 years ago, was now disarmed under the totalitarian jackboot. There might have been resistance possible by the German population in 1933 or 34 if they decided to do it, but it was no longer possible with the society under full control and disarmed. We'd had registration, and then confiscation, and then the extermination would soon begin. Now, there's an image people get of the Jews boarding the train cars from, say, the Netherlands to what would be extermination camps in Poland. But it's important to render that's sort of an iconic image, and people think, oh, the Jews were just all passive and they just went along with their fate and they never fought back. And that's certainly true for some of them. But first of all, it's important to remember that many of them never found out that death was their intended fate until it was too late. It had not been uncommon in the Jewish experience of, well, the government here has changed, and so we've been living in this town, and now they're going to move us 600 miles away. All right, just pick it up, go along, and go someplace else. And they did that, and it might have been a Trail of Tears experience in some cases, but it was something that, as a group at least, could be survived. They didn't know they were getting on the trains to go to extermination camps, and they didn't know when they were getting off the trains and thought they were getting into the showers, that they were going to be poison gassed. But there were many, many Jews who did figure out what was going on and did fight back. Now, it's well known that for whatever reasons, the Allies, with their massive bombing campaign, destroying, justifiably in my view, many German cities and their war factories, never bombed the train tracks leading to the extermination camps. Some of the camps were eventually put out of business by the advances of Allied troops, but never by any deliberate military action, with one important exception, and that was done by the Jews themselves in the camp, the Sobibor extermination camp in Poland. It's detailed in the book and movie, Escape from Sobibor. It was a very efficient camp. It gassed thousands of people per day. It was run by Germans with the assistance of several dozen Ukrainian guards. And of course, as was common, much of the day-to-day work of the camp was done by, such as carpentry or whatever, was done by Jews who were allowed, at least temporarily, to survive for doing this work. So when some Soviet Jewish prisoners were brought into the camp, they had the military skills and began thinking about and organizing an escape in cooperation with the other prisoners. Now, there was a risk that they could have been caught by turned over by some of the Jewish spies within their midst. But they used crudely improvised weapons, quickly killed a few Nazi officers, and then they got the key to the camp armory. There was a wild battle that followed. 600 prisoners tried to flee. About 400 of them got outside the camp boundaries, and about half of those 400 made it past the landmine field around the camp. And many of the escapees were caught later, but about 60 of them, led by the Soviet officer Alexander Perchersky, made contact with Soviet partisans and joined them. In this escape effort, 10 SS troops were killed, 1 was wounded, 38 Ukrainian guards were killed or wounded, and 40 other Ukrainian guards decided they didn't like their job anyway and deserted. 4 days after the revolt, a special German unit destroyed the Sobibor camp completely in an attempt to keep the revolt a secret. A death camp which had put 600,000 people to death was put out of operation forever. Now, you'll sometimes hear people say, violence never solves anything. Well, violence solved Sobibor. The solution to the final solution was the violent destruction of the Nazi regime, and the Jews at Sobibor certainly did their part. Of all the German concentration camps and extermination camps that were built over Europe, it was only at the Jewish camps where there were revolts. There were other, Treblinka, Auschwitz, others had revolts, none as successful as Sobibor, but they at least impeded the operations of those camps for a while. Poland, that great haven of the Jews in the Middle Ages, was about 10% Jewish at the beginning of World War II. And this was a nation which had been, unfortunately, had quickly lapsed into an anti-Semitic military dictatorship, and then things got worse when the country was divided by the Nazi-Soviet pact, and still worse when Hitler attacked the Soviets and took the whole country. In Poland, as in elsewhere, the Nazi program was first of all to concentrate the entire Jewish population in a special urban zone, walled urban zone, called a ghetto, and not just the population, say, of Warsaw, but from the farms or areas surrounding Warsaw would be brought in. And then they would tell the Judenrat, the Jewish community leaders or people who were trying to find some accommodation with the Nazis, that look, just you stay in your place, you do slave labor for us in our war factories, and everything will be fine. But of course it wasn't. The ghettos were continually constricted, the walls kept closing in, rations were cut, people starved to death, infectious disease was rampant, and then people started getting deported to who knows they didn't where. In late 1942, Emanuel Ringelblum, who wrote a diary from inside the Warsaw Ghetto, wrote this: "Whomever you talk to, you hear the same cry. The resettlement never should have been permitted. We should have run into the streets, set fire to everything in sight, have torn down the walls and escaped to the other side. The Germans would have taken their revenge. It would have cost tens of thousands of lives, but not 300,000. Now we are ashamed of ourselves, disgraced in our own eyes and in the eyes of the world, where our docility has earned us nothing. This must not be repeated now. We must put up a resistance, defend ourselves against the enemy, man and child." And so on January 18th, when the Germans did another roundup of 7,000 more Jews from the Warsaw Ghetto to send them to the extermination camp in Treblinka, the Jewish Fighting Organization began a revolt. They had 600 volunteers. The Jewish Military Association in Warsaw had 400, and there were also smaller spontaneous groups. This revolt started with only 10 handguns. That's all they had. But as every police officer who goes and sheriff's deputy goes out on patrol and has a handgun and maybe goes into a situation, you say the handgun is what you use to get you the time till you can get to your rifle or your shotgun. And likewise, it was these handguns that helped the Jews get more arms. And so after 4 days of fighting, the Germans on January 21st pulled back from the ghetto to reorganize. And here's another Warsaw Ghetto diary. In the 4 days of fighting, we have made up for the shame of Jewish passivity in the first extermination action of July 1942. Not only the Germans were shocked by the unexpected resistance, Jews too were astonished. They could not imagine until then that beaten, exhausted victims could rise against a mighty enemy who had conquered all of Europe. Many Jews who were in the streets of Warsaw during the fighting refused to believe that on Zamenhof and Mila streets, Jewish boys and girls had attacked Germans. The large-scale fighting which followed convinced all that it was possible. And so then in February the next month, the Polish Home Army transferred 50 revolvers and 50 hand grenades, although many of the revolvers didn't work, but some did, and 4 pounds of explosives to the Warsaw Ghetto Jews. And the Warsaw Jews also were manufacturing their own explosives as best they could, especially Molotov cocktails. And by the way, Molotov, the evil Russian foreign minister, didn't think up the Molotov cocktail. The Molotov cocktail was used by the Finns in their winter war against the Soviet imperialist tanks, and that's how Finland, one of the reasons Finland was able to maintain its freedom from Soviet colonial imperialism. The Germans were getting kind of annoyed with this, and so on February 16, 1943, Heinrich Himmler gave the order that the Warsaw Ghetto be exterminated by April 19th, and this was because he was a thoughtful guy. Hitler's birthday was coming up on April 20th, and he wanted to give Hitler a Judenrein Warsaw as a present. So April 19th was also Passover, and the Jews had long been eating those bitter herbs of slavery, and now they had the wine of freedom. Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister, and a really nasty guy, even by Nazi standards, wrote in his diary, "The joke cannot last much longer, but it shows what the Jews are capable of when they have arms in their hands." And so the Nazis brought in tanks, but the Jews now were ready for explosives. First one tank and then a second were immobilized in the middle of the street in flames. Their crews burned alive. Emanuel Ringelblum's diary recalls. Now the fighters, as well as the non-combatant Jews who have crawled out of their hiding places, have reached the pinnacle of jubilation. According to one eyewitness account, the faces who only yesterday reflected terror and despair now shone with an unusual joy which is difficult to describe. This was a joy free from all personal motives, a joy imbued with the pride that the ghetto was fighting. Another eyewitness describes the confusion in the German ranks. There runs a German soldier, shrieking like an insane one, the helmet on his head on fire. Another one shouts madly, "Juden, Waffen! Juden, Waffen!" or Jews, weapons. But the Jewish Warsaw fighters began to run out of ammunition. And part of the existential, literally, problem they had was Poland at the time, and certainly Jewish Poland before the war, had hardly any gun culture. So very few Jews had the equipment for what is called reloading, which is the home manufacture of ammunition. Reloading is, in its most basic level, you go to the shooting range and you fire the bullet, that lead projectile, so you don't use that again, and you had some gunpowder in there which burned up to cause the explosion and use the gases to force the bullet out and downrange. And what you have left over is typically a brass shell that held the primer, the gunpowder, and the lead bullet. Well, if you're a competitive target shooter, or you just like to tinker around the house for the same reason that you might like other people, or the same kind of people, may like ham radio, people do hand loading, or reloading as it's called, which is you take those shells and then you buy some, in America, you buy some new components and remanufacture some new ammunition. But you don't have to buy new bullets at the store. If you know how to cast lead into molds, you can make the new bullets yourself. And it's difficult to make modern smokeless gunpowder, but as the American revolutionaries well knew, you can make smokier black powder with ingredients you can get at home. But there wasn't any of that in the Warsaw Ghetto because there wasn't a gun culture to support it beforehand, so that they would have been able to remanufacture their own ammunition. That said, the Hitler didn't get his birthday present, and so on April 22nd, the Germans decided that they were done with the house-to-house fighting, and they were now going to burn the entire Warsaw Ghetto to the ground. And so they did. And this was the largest urban fire in Europe ever since Nero's fire in Rome. And even that didn't finish things off. Major General Jürgen Stroop said he'd get things done quickly on April 23rd, but the fighting continued for months after that. The Germans suffered over 1,000 casualties in that first week of the Warsaw Ghetto fighting. It took them longer to subdue the Warsaw Ghetto than it had taken them to conquer the entire nation of Poland or to conquer the entire nation of France. So don't let anybody say that fighting Jews or fighting genocide resistors can't make a difference. They performed better than the French army did. Yeah. Yeah. And they had an effect not only on the Germans militarily, it had a huge effect on the attitudes of the West, the Warsaw Ghetto Revolt. As the word began to get out in the West, the Western media began to change its attitude towards the European Jews. As Harper's Magazine explained, they concluded that the Jews had earned the right to be regarded not as supplicants, but as allies. Harper's continued, as the British press was the first to admit, the Jews now have a new and different claim for consideration, a claim not of passive victims, but of active allies and partners who have fought the common enemy. And so truly, if you think about the great founders of the State of Israel, the Warsaw Ghetto fighters are in the first rank of them. There were other uprisings in Polish ghettos, six of them, six in Poland and still more in Lithuania and Belarus. Always, none was as major as the Warsaw. Some were suppressed much more easily than the Warsaw Ghetto Revolt. And part of the problem the Jews faced, in fact, the essential problem, the life or death problem, was the lack of weapons. They would try to make what were called cold weapons, such as filling a light bulb with sulfuric acid or finding a rusty iron rod and trying to file it into a knife. They learned judo, but they knew that for real fighting, for the fighting they needed to do, they needed to have firearms. And the problem was not only the absence of many firearms in Jewish hands to begin with, even before the war, but even when firearms had been available, like in the chaos of the Nazi-Soviet fighting, or for that matter, the Nazis versus the Polish army in the fall of 1939, war does have a way of causing confusion and often leaving a lot of weapons lying around. And sometimes they had been picked up by Jews, but they had often been turned in once the Nazis established their control and warned that anybody found with a rifle would be killed. The survival rate for Jews who fought was much higher than for those who did not. For example, in Minsk, Belarus, the Jewish survival rate was 50% greater than any other section of Eastern Europe, and that was primarily because there was an underground fighting organization there. And of the 80,000 Jews in Minsk, about 10,000 of them made it into the woods to fight as partisans, and half of them survived the war. Now, this was an easier thing to do in Eastern Poland, in Belarus, and in Lithuania with their swamps and their forested terrain than it was on the more plainsy regions in Western Poland where it was harder to hide. Vilna, Lithuania, often considered a New Jerusalem for its great learning. If you know your Talmud, you know that one of the great Talmuds of all time is the Vilna Talmud. The resistance there was led by a young poet named Abba Kovner, and he assembled a group around him known as the Avengers, who escaped into the woods around Vilna. His lieutenants and his bedmates were teenage girls, Vitka Kepner, and Ruzka Korzak. These Avengers were the first partisans in Europe to blow up a Nazi train. As the war was ending, they brought huge numbers of Jews to Palestine, violating the British blockade. They had belonged to before the war, to the left-wing Zionist youth group called the Young Guard, Hashamor Hatzair, which taught Jews about self-defense and shooting. Now, they weren't religious, but they were fervent Zionists, and they loved reading the Bible stories of the Jewish heroes and the warriors, and they wanted to emulate them. And when they said to the older people of the community, we have to fight, they're going to kill us otherwise, it's our only chance, and even if we're going to die anyway, we should die fighting. They said, no, don't do that, it's going to lead to reprisals, it'll just make things worse. And Ruska-Korzak responded that stories of Jewish heroism can't be only a part of our ancient history. They must be part of our real life as well. How good will the next generation of Jews be if their entire history is one of slaughter and extermination? We cannot allow that. It must also have heroic struggles, self-defense, war, and even death with honor. And perhaps the greatest guerrilla band of Jews was the Bielski brothers in Lithuania. They were different from the other guerrilla bands because they would actually take in refugees, old women, people who were too young or too disabled or too whatever to be able to fight. They eventually hid 1,200 people out in the woods, and 95% of those people survived. Tuvya Bielski, it was the Bielski brothers who led this, said, I'd rather save one old Jewish woman than kill 10 German soldiers. But actually, he did a lot of both. It was the largest Jewish partisan force anywhere in Europe. About 1,200 Jews total, including 149 armed combatants. Just from the fall of 1943 to the summer of 1944, they did 38 combat missions, destroyed 2 locomotives, destroyed 23 train cars, 32 telephone poles, and 4 bridges, and killed 381 enemy fighters. So if you think of the resistance in Europe, half the partisans in Poland were Jewish in 1942 to 43. There were 30,000 Jewish partisans who fought in Eastern Europe, and there were armed revolts in over 40 different Eastern European ghettos. Now, outside of Eastern Europe, in Eastern Europe, the other resistance groups wouldn't allow Jewish members in there. But in France, that was fine to be Jewish and be a resistance fighter. And in fact, Jews who were 1% of the French population were about 15 to 20% of the Jewish resistors. The Jews were never given arms by the Allies. Now, if they were in the French resistance, or if you were in a Soviet military partisan brigade, yes, you got Western military aid. But the Jewish-only groups, the ones fighting in Belarus and Lithuania and Poland, never got arms from the Allies, and they were the only partisan groups who never received arms. Now, these days, it seems everybody says never again, and most people are against the Holocaust, except for a very large segment of political leaders in the Middle East who deny that the Holocaust ever happened, but say that if it had, it wouldn't have been such a bad idea. But there's a difference between, but the Holocaust was not the only mass murder by government in the 20th century. The University of Hawaii political scientist R.J. Rummel has done demographic research on this, quantifying the number of mass murders by governments from 1901 to 1990. Now, this isn't counting war casualties, and this isn't counting civilian casualties as collateral damage in war. If you're doing artillery shelling of some city and you're trying to hit an army barracks, and you kill the soldiers there and you kill 3,000 other civilians, he's not counting that. He's only counting the intentional mass murder of people by governments in the 20th century from 1901 to 1990. And his estimate is 169,198,000 killed by governments. Not only Stalin, Mao, Pol Pot, Idi Amin in Uganda, sort of the famous ones, but lots of others that never got nearly as much attention. The risk of life from criminal governments is overwhelmingly larger than the risk of life from lone criminals. And if you buy the hypothesis of the American gun prohibition lobbies, who will say, oh, look at those peaceful, civilized Europeans with all their strict gun laws, and look at our comparatively different homicide rate. And actually ours has come down quite a lot in the past 2 decades, even as the gun supply has now increased so much we have more than 1 gun per person in the United States. But let's take the gun prohibitionists' argument, let's presume it's true. Let's say the entire difference between the average homicide rate of Western Europe and the homicide rate of the United States is entirely due to gun laws. And this is a sort of an extreme exception because this is blaming America's lax gun laws for stranglings, knifings, all kinds of things. But let's say that's true. Add up you could say, okay, then now let's adjust. How many lives would have been saved in the United States versus Europe comparatively by having these supposedly life-saving European-style gun laws? That number is dwarfed just by the number who were killed in a single year by the one criminal government of Germany. And it's a very, very small number indeed compared to the number of people who were killed by the other criminal governments that ruled Europe at various other times in the 20th century. And of course, this isn't just a European problem. Uganda is a good example under the Idi Amin regime of how when the international community says never again, it too often doesn't go beyond doing anything about it. Now you can say, oh, well, why didn't somebody do something about the genocide that Stalin was doing? Well, because the Soviet Union is a rather difficult country to invade and do something about, as has been proved repeatedly. Well, why didn't somebody do something about the genocide going on in Cambodia under the Pol Pot? Well, because the Pol Pot regime was the ally of the Chinese Communist government, a massive regional power on its way to becoming a global superpower. And the Americans actually tried invading Cambodia, and that didn't work out too well in the long term. So what could you do about it? But Uganda was different. Idi Amin was well known as a nut and an international pariah. He wasn't like Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe, currently perpetrating mass murders, who happens to be a close ally of the South African and Chinese governments. Idi Amin didn't have any powerful international patrons, and his army was miserable. His army, there were 13 million Ugandans. He had an army of 25,000 and then a secret police of 3,000, the so-called State Research Bureau. His army was ill-disciplined and incompetent, and when Idi Amin made the further blunder of starting a war with neighboring Tanzania in late 1978, the Tanzanian army, which is not really considered one of the greatest in world history, had an easy time crushing him in a matter of few weeks. And so how was it that this small, barely competent army of Idi Amin was able to carry out a genocide in the full view of the world? This wasn't something that was hidden. It wasn't like if only we'd known. Everybody knew what was going on. You could read it in the newspapers. And he did it against 13 million Ugandans. Well, Uganda, like much of the former British Empire, had its copy of the 1921 British Firearms Act, which, to simplify, in Britain it required a license to own a rifle or a handgun. In the Cambodian version, the Ugandan version, it also required that for any type of firearm. And obviously that law has not led to genocide in the United Kingdom. And it would be certainly false to think that gun control always leads to genocide. But it often facilitates it in places where people want it to happen. And this simple licensing law, enacted in Uganda in 1955 by the British imperial government, was the tool by which the post-independence governments, such as the dictator Milton Obote in 1966, could use the licensing system to deny the vast majority of Ugandans any firearms, with the exception of government officials and their pet favorites. And so Idi Amin was able to perpetrate mass murder with very little resistance, and the international community, despite all the very nice resolutions that have been passed since 1945 and the defeat of the Germans and the Nazis, did absolutely nothing about it. So how do you prevent genocide? Well, there's not simply one answer to that, as preventing any kind of crime usually doesn't have a single answer. And certainly you can hope that democratic elections and a free press will prevent that, but that's not always the case. Hitler came to power legally with the existence of a free press, and sometimes when dictators get in, they stop doing the democratic elections and the free press. There's also the idea of deterrence by having international tribunals for punishment afterwards of genocide perpetrators. And this is something that's been talked about for a long time, and other than the war criminals of World War II, there was a long period of impunity for genocide perpetrators. Idi Amin, after losing power, went off to live in Saudi Arabia and had a quite comfortable existence and was never extradited or prosecuted. Pol Pot went to live in China and likewise lived it up and continued to plot to get back into power. There have been some prosecutions post hoc for the genocides in Rwanda and Srebrenica, Yugoslavia. But it doesn't seem yet that these punishments are sufficient to deter or prevent all future crimes. And just as we don't expect that even in an ideally functioning criminal justice system, that post hoc punishment of perpetrators will in itself prevent all future crimes. There's also another thing that when people say, okay, well, there's Germans and Ugandans and Cambodians, things really got out of control. Chinese, Russians, Guatemalans, Zimbabweans, and many more. Well, they got kind of out of control, but this could never happen here in the United States. And I think the United States, probably better than any other country in the world, has many safeguards against that happening. Our Constitution was written as an anti-tyranny document. It was written to have the whole purpose of the Constitution is the prevention of tyranny. On the one hand, making sure that there will not be a government that is so unchecked and so out of control that it can tyrannize the people. And at the same time, making sure that we have a strong enough national government that protects us from the imposition of tyranny from abroad. And that was the great challenge that the founders faced in trying to create a government that could prevent both kinds of tyranny, and they did a phenomenally good job of it. But that's no guarantee that things always work out forever. Let's take a look at 2 points in history. 1944, we were winning World War II by then, pretty clearly. And the Gallup poll asked Americans, so what do you think we should do with Japan as a country after the war? 13% of Americans chose this response: kill all Japanese people. That's 13% of the American population favored that. Now, I don't think you'd get 13% in favor of that now, but what if the war had gone worse? What if we'd been perhaps not defeated, but humiliated, or the war had gone on for years and years? There were a lot of ways in which World War II was a close-run thing. What might have happened to those Japanese in the American concentration camps? We don't know, but we can't be certain that it would not have led to mass killings. Or put yourself in the year 1900, and you're sitting around a nice salon in Paris, chatting with your well-educated friends in French, that being the lingua franca of the time, and Marty McFly shows up from Back to the Future and tells you, you know what, it's 1900. In the next 50 years, there's going to be a country, and I'm not going to tell you which one, but it's going to be a country that is going to perpetrate mass murder by the millions against a religious or ethnic or racial minority. Who do you think it's going to be? Well, if you're a well-informed guy in 1900, you'd say, Russians and Jews, I could definitely see that happening, and you have a lot of good reasons for that, long history of state violence against them. You might think, oh boy, the Germans with the French with all this Dreyfus affair, I can't see them getting that out of, I know that's a bad thing that they're persecuting this Jewish officer and they got a lot of anti-Semitism there, but maybe they could do that, but that would seem going too far. Oh, the United States, oh God, do you know how they treat the black people over there? It's ridiculous. They keep on oppressing them and they run out of things to oppress them on, they have to invent new things to oppress them on, just for their political dynamics. So it certainly could be that. But you wouldn't pick Germany, the most philo-Semitic country in the world at the time. The country where, compared to every place else, Jews had advanced openly in the arts, literature, sciences, government, medicine, law. Best place in the world to be a civilized, well-educated Jew was Germany in 1900. And if you'd taken a public opinion poll in Germany in 1900 and said, how many here in favor of killing all the Jews, you would not have gotten 13%, or I think even 1% in favor of that. But in 35 years, circumstances changed. And that just shows that in the world, you can't tell how circumstances can change in 35 years. So one way to reduce genocide in the future would be if every family in the world owned a good quality rifle and an ample quantity of ammunition. And not only would there be less genocide, there'd also be less torture and less extreme violations of other human rights. Now again, well, how do you know that would happen? Why, well, the governments have tanks, they've got nuclear weapons, poison gas, all this stuff. Yeah, but what we know is, look at the governments that have perpetrated genocide. Look at the governments that perpetrate mass torture today and the other most extreme, widespread violations of human rights. How many of them have well-armed citizens? None. How many of them have assiduously attempted to disarm the people who were victimized or who are now being victimized? Every single one of them. These are the governments who are the professionals at it. They're the ones who care about getting the job done right. And from their point of view, it seems to matter a lot to take the arms away from the victims first before you start the mass murder and the other mass atrocities. There's a second way in which mass disarmament leads to genocide. Not always, but makes it possible. And this goes back to the original Zionist point. One of the American founders was Joel Barlow, associated with Yale University, one of a group of writers called the Connecticut Wits, wrote essays in favor of the American system of government. Disarmament palsies the hand and brutalizes the mind. An habitual disuse of physical force totally destroys the moral, and men lose at once the power of protecting themselves and discerning the cause of their oppression. Now, he was not Jewish, but he could well have been a great Zionist writing like that. The principle of Jews or other people fighting to resist and deter and prevent genocide, you can find it in stories as old as the story of Queen Esther in the Bible, and you don't have to believe that as a literal historical fact to believe that it's a moral fact, and that's why it's in there. When after Haman's wicked plot to incite the genocide of the Jews was discovered and uncovered by Queen Esther, who outed herself as a Jew, then what happened? The Jews, which were in every city the king sent out a second decree for the Jews to gather themselves together and to stand for their life, to destroy and to slay, and to cause to perish all the power of the people and provinces that would assault them. Thus the Jews smote all their enemies with a stroke of the sword. The other Jews that were in the king's provinces gathered themselves together and stood for their lives and had rest from their enemies. Hubert Humphrey, the Platonic and real embodiment of post-war American liberalism. If you thought that more government, more federal spending to help the people was a good idea, there was no better exponent of that than Senator Hubert Horatio Humphrey of Minnesota. Took the modern Democratic Party into the civil rights era with his speech at the 1948 Democratic Convention, telling the party to walk and leave the shadows of states' rights and walk into the bright sunshine of human rights. We today have the Federal Reserve managing monetary policy by the Humphrey-Hawkins bill, which requires monetary policy to be managed to reduce unemployment. So he was no small government, minimalist, Tea Party type of fellow in the sense of he thought that he was taxed enough already. He thought taxes were swell and spending was even sweller. He served as President Lyndon Johnson's vice president. Here's what he said about the meaning of the Second Amendment. The right of citizens to bear arms is just one more guarantee against arbitrary government, one more safeguard against the tyranny which now appears remote in America, but which is historically proved to be always possible. It's across all the human experience, from Hubert Humphrey and Queen Esther and the Zionists in between, and every continent in this world, and really every century in this world, when people can arm themselves for self-defense, we have less violence, the world is safer, and if we want to prevent genocide in the future, then we need to do our best to ensure that the possible victims in the future have the ability to protect themselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was so fascinating. I actually felt pride in a lot of the things that you said. And I'm guessing that the Nazis actually probably suspected that the Jews were a lot stronger than the Jews think they are. Just my thought.
Sure, I think that there's a lot of Nazi psychological warfare against the Jews on every level, like even in their identity documents. You couldn't be, a man's name would be officially changed to Israel. That was the only first name you could have for a man. And likewise, a woman's name would be changed to Sarah, stripping them of their very core. And so the Nazis did try to make the Jews weak, but they did not succeed, ultimately.
So I'm going to take questions, and we're going to take I'm going to ask that you please limit your question to a question. And I'm going to go on either side, and I will get to everybody, I promise.
Well, I didn't get a chance to mention it earlier to Professor Kopel, but I wanted to thank you for your fine work on Manchin-Toomey, exposing the truth of the Manchin-Toomey bill in the Lavala conspiracy a couple of years ago. You are the guy who I think should get the Second Amendment Award of the Year for that, because they almost crammed that garbage bill in the federal Senate down our throats, and you're the guy who exposed the lies that were in it, and just how bad it was going to be for anybody who respected the Second Amendment.
Well,
thanks.
Thank you. Yes, very briefly, the Manchin-Toomey amendment, which was the Senate ended up not adopting in April of 2013, is a good example of one of those gun laws. You can agree with everything I've said, but you don't have to say, oh, there can never be any gun laws about anything, and we can't have any background checks, no gun laws, nothing. I'm not saying that at all. There's a lot of room for legitimate arms laws, the ones that really do promote public safety. Manchin-Toomey had the problem being something that at the top line, if all you knew was the 3-sentence summary, you'd think it was a fine thing, but it was very badly drafted. And part of the problem on that was on the drafting side, you had one lawyer from one gun organization who was trying to do the right thing, and the mass of lawyers from the Michael Bloomberg lobby on the other side. And what came out, technically speaking, was just effective. For example, it was something that said, oh, we're going to outlaw federal gun registration and make it a crime for a federal official to register guns. But when you actually read it, it had the effect of actually reducing existing federal barriers to gun registration.
Thank you very much for your presentation here. It was excellent. Also to pose this question, somebody in your telephone, what motivates you to come to Colorado to speak to a limited number of people here tonight?
Your fine president who invited me.
Over here.
That's Oklahoma City, a great outcry about all the militias. After Oklahoma City, there was a great outcry about militias, and Dave Foxman led the charge. And until he got a letter from a militia in Arizona, we're Jews, we're Orthodox, and we're armed. And he shut the hell up.
I did not know that. Oh, by the way, I will say many of you may know, but the Jewish group that is particularly focused on Second Amendment rights is Jews for the Preservation of Firearms Ownership, which is now part of the Second Amendment Foundation, which is one of the long-standing pro-rights organizations that has been around since about 1974. For fighting in the political sense.
Professor Kopel, would you just comment on the FDR's many efforts to implement gun control in the 30s? It never came to fruition, but there were plans, much like Obama has plans to implement gun control here. FDR had similar plans in the 30s. Can you just comment on that?
Sure, and I'd say it was probably less Franklin Roosevelt than it was his first Attorney General, Homer Cummings, who's Arizona Attorney David Hardy, who writes the web blog called Arms and the Law, which is a very good, it's one of only two Second Amendment related blogs that I follow consistently, has read Cummings' papers, and Cummings certainly wanted a British-style system of comprehensive national registration and licensing of all arms. And the reason he didn't get that was because American gun owners fought in a political sense against that successfully, and Congress listened. And this was in the days, and the National Rifle Association was the most important single reason in that, using its member magazine to encourage people to write letters to their congresspeople and express their opinion on the issue.
Any more questions? Yes. I'm going to go here now.
What do you expect with the future of gun control in the USA over the next few years, depending how elections go?
Well, that is, you've hit the crucial variable there. We're in a new situation. Michael Bloomberg and fellow billionaires are, I mean, if they wanted to, they could have gun control tomorrow. They could buy all the guns in the United States with the money they have lying around in the spare change in their couches. The amount of money that is going to go into what they would call public education, or I might call misleading propaganda, on the anti-gun side, and not just in favor of particular measures, which people can argue about pro and con, but to create a climate of fear that guns are bad, gun owners are something you should be scared of. If your neighbor owns a gun, you should be scared of that just for that fact alone. The amount of money is going to be huge, and we've had very little experience in this country of that much money being poured into a single issue. The amount of money the National Rifle Association, this organization with about 5 million members, staff of several hundred, I think, something that said, has, it's nothing. It's a small fraction of all that, all those citizens together. You know, say, oh, the gun industry gives them money. Well, all the money they get from the gun industry and all the money they get from, you know, gun owners and all the money they get from selling logo wear and all that, it's tiny just compared to the wealth of one of these guys, like Michael Bloomberg or others. So who knows what effect that money's going to have. The nice thing is we still have one person, one vote. And so it will be another case of the people versus the plutocracy if the Second Amendment is going to survive. And that will depend on citizen activists educating not only thinking about the issue themselves, but constructively being involved in political activism.
And the irony that the American Jewish community is so pro-gun control, starting with Bloomberg and, you know, so many of them. Look at the mess in Chicago.
Well, but, you know, you can talk about any group of people, and you know, Jews poll this way, and whatever, you know, this religion polls that way, and this ethnicity and all that. You know, but within any group, there's always differences of opinion. And so, whatever group you happen to be involved in, whether it's your, you know, the PTA or a synagogue or whatever, there's the opportunity to reach out to people one-on-one and communicate with them. And I'm sure, as you know from everything else in life, the best way to communicate with somebody and help them change their mind is not to directly confront them and tell them why they're so wrong about everything. You know, it's to find the places where you agree and see where you can bring them along, and certainly programs that introduce people to target shooting and gun use in a responsible and safe way are probably, in the long run, the single most important thing. You can't, plenty of people who own guns support some gun controls. Now, I'm in that category, by the way. But the people who are most susceptible to the most extreme lies and deceits of the gun prohibition movement are the people who have the least familiarity. So when you take somebody out, shoot a BB gun in some safe place, whatever. All that kind of stuff is probably the single most important thing in the long run. You can analogize it to gay rights. And that will convince some people, but my father was in the state legislature for 22 years, liberal Democrat from Denver. And when I was moving back to Colorado after living in the Northeast for a while, I was thinking about what to do. And I said, well, what about being a lobbyist? They said, no, it'd be terrible. You would try to convince people with logical arguments. And that's not going to get you anywhere in lobbying. So the logical arguments are fine for some people, but not for everybody. It's also the same as with gay rights. I mean, one of the things that ultimately is winning that culture war for them is gay people coming out. And you tell your friend at work, obviously it all depends on the circumstances and it's very individual. But when somebody meets another gay individual, it's like, oh, wow, you're like pretty regular. You're not like these characters I see in the movies from 1971 about like what gay people are like. No, actually, yeah, we're quite a lot like other people. Same thing for gun owners. Come out of the closet and as you see fit in your own individual way for taking into account all the circumstances. But that is certainly part of it, being the face of responsible gun ownership to the individuals in your community.
And this will be our last question. Okay.
So I just wanted to amplify your point about the Holocaust, in that there's a French priest who has written the book Holocaust by Bullets, and he has documented that 1 million to 1.5 million Jews in Russia, Lithuania, Ukraine were killed in small towns and villages that each had a few thousand Jews, and they were taken by a very small number of SS and local collaborators into the forests, were forced to dig their graves and were shot, and in those cases really a tiny number of guns would have made a huge difference. So it's
yes, and exactly. One of the things you're talking about, for example, is the Einsatzgruppe, where it took a while. Even the Germans, with all their infrastructure, efficiency, and skills, To create these mass, it's like building any mass thing. It takes a while to build these camps, get the rail connections in, all this whole machinery of death. So the mass murders started with the Einsatz group, and it's basically trained squads of assassins going out and killing people. And yeah, if instead of 100 people being shot in the head in front of the mass grave they're standing in front of, some of them shoot back. They all end up dead anyway, but maybe they kill 1 or 3 or 4 or maybe more, God willing, of the incipient murderers. And that leaves fewer incipient murderers to kill the next person. The fact that you die in a good cause doesn't mean that your death is at all futile. It's all the resistance that a person offers is sacrificially helping to save somebody down the line in ways, of course, that nobody can predict exactly how it will happen.
I've heard from several speakers that Homeland Security has, in the last 5 years, bought up millions of rounds of hollow point. Any thoughts on that? What's going on?
And 700 agencies. Many agencies.
I don't really know the answer. Certainly by governments, just because the budgetary imperative is over, we're coming at the end of the budget cycle and we have, oh, well, look, there's $3 billion lying on the floor, we better spend it now. Oh, let's buy a bunch of ammunition. Maybe part of that explanation. And certainly buying hollow point bullets for any is, I think generally for public safety purposes, the appropriate kind to purchase. For example, every sheriff's department, sheriff's office in Colorado, I know, requires jacketed hollow points only for deputies to carry for rifles or handguns, because they are doubly safe. They're the most likely to deliver the fight-stopping hit by transferring the kinetic energy to the aggressor, and they're the least likely to ricochet, to overpenetrate, or do anything else. So there's a terrible decision in a case called Jackson versus San Francisco, which upholds, kind of oddly, San Francisco's law saying you can't buy hollow points in the city. You can, and the court upholds it in part by saying, well, that's okay, you can just go to another city, so what's the big deal? But the point is that hollow points, as the vast majority of people who have experience in teaching defensive armed safety would tell you, are usually the best, the safest ground for all purposes, safest for bystanders, safest.
But they're not used by our military. So why does our government use
one of the oddities of war is that the Geneva Conventions have, going back over a century, have outlawed their use in war. But for domestic law enforcement, which includes, in my mind, law-abiding police officers, law-abiding sheriff's deputies, and law-abiding citizens, all of them who may be fighting for the defense of self and others against criminal aggressors, hollow points are legitimate and appropriate.
Do you know of any organizations that not only teach marksmanship, but also teach you how to build your own weapon?
There must be such organizations, but I don't know.
Another workshop for Jews. A lot of manufactured plastic.
In listening to your debate and the discussion of the whole history, I was thinking, you can boil it down to one concept. Without the right of self-defense and the means to carry that out, you have no rights at all.
You have just summed up the classical foundation of international law. Hugo Grotius, Samuel von Pufendorf, Emery Vattel, many others agree that there is a natural law that is known to all humans. Some things in religion are revealed, depending on what religion you're in, but there's belief that there's a common humanity, because we all have we're all humans, and that there is a moral truth that is accessible to all humans upon reflection and considering our common human experiences. And they would all say that the right of self-defense is that foundation of international law, which in turn was founded on natural law. That's right. Now you can say other rights are more important. Maybe you'd rather, your right to freedom of religion. I mean, that's the most personal thing, your conscience. What could be more inside you than that? And other people would say other rights, and other people, whatever. The right of self-defense is by however you want to order them, a critical thing, because if you don't have that as a right, then no other right you have exists. Nothing else in your life is secure.
Do you recommend that all Jews, certainly all Americans, become members of the NRA, and any woman who wants to consider herself a feminist purchase a handgun?
I am a NRA, I think, benefactor member, which puts it's the highest level you could keep giving the money for, which is 3 levels above a life membership. So it means if it turns out that Hinduism is correct and I get reincarnated 3 times, whatever state I'm in, at least I'm going to still keep getting the magazine. So I think joining the organization is a good idea, but I'd also say that part of being a feminist in the best and most positive sense is about empowerment and personal choice, and not having something, I have to do this because society or the group I'm with or whatever is telling me to do this. It's about ultimately, in the positive, most positive way, as Marla Thomas said, free to be you and me. So I would never prescribe to somebody to be a feminist, you have to be in this or that organization.
Is a woman safer with or without a gun?
It depends on the woman and the circumstances, but for the woman who's learned how to use it, often safer.
David, thank you so much. I just want to say that this has been video filming this presentation. I'm going to send it out, and I hope that you forward it to everybody you know, because I think it's probably the most important thing we've discussed.
Thank you. Next year in Jerusalem.